The Falklands War did not end. It became a ghost, and now the United States may be waking it up. Not with tanks, not with Argentine Marines landing on the beach, not with another warship burning in the South Atlantic. With a memo, a leaked Pentagon email floated the idea of reviewing the United States' position on Britain's claim to these islands, the same islands Britain fought and bled to keep in 1982. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lorda, where we explore Latin America's history, mysteries, true crime, and local legends, always whispering Latin intrigue. Subscribe for fresh revelations every week, perfect for your next campfire debate. This is not a video about Iran. It is not even really a video about Britain. This is a video about how Latin America remembers land after the empire has sailed away, and why a cold group of islands near Patagonia can still make presidents, soldiers, veterans, and widows speak as if the war never ended. The Falklands, Las Malvinas. Two names for the same wind, two maps for the same wound. And now that wound is waking up again. In 2026, while the world was watching the war around Iran, a strange spark appeared on the other side of the planet. A leaked Pentagon email, described by Reuters, floated the idea of reviewing America's position on Britain's claim to the islands. Not an official policy, not a declaration, more like a match held near dry grass. Because when empires quarrel, they sometimes punish each other by touching old wounds they did not create, but know exactly how to reopen. That is why this story begins with a contradiction. Nobody is invading the Malvinas tomorrow. That is not the real danger. The danger is quieter. A war can become a ghost. A battlefield can become a diplomatic weapon. A place that looked frozen in 1982 can suddenly begin moving again, not because soldiers are landing on the beach, but because powerful men far away have started asking whether the map should still look the way it does. Look at the islands from above, and they seem almost too lonely to matter. They sit in the South Atlantic about 500 kilometers from Argentina, but almost 13,000 kilometers from Britain. Gray Sea, peat bog, rock, sheep, penguins, a capital called Stanley, where most of the little population lives under skies that never look fully convinced by the sun. Yet these islands are not tiny dots. They are large, windswept, and heavy with memory. Britain calls them the Falkland Islands. Argentina calls them the Malvinas. That difference is not decoration. A name is a flag spoken out loud. In Argentina, the Malvinas are printed into school books, official maps, speeches, identity documents, weather forecasts, airport walls, and memory. Children grow up seeing them as part of the nation, floating just off Patagonia like a missing bone. In Britain, the islands are fiercely defended when threatened. Still, for many people, those far away live on mostly through anniversaries, war stories, and sudden crises. So keep one image with you, a map on a classroom wall. In one country, the islands are colored as Argentine. In another, they are British. Same rocks, same grass, same graves, but the ink changes the prayer. Maps are never innocent. A map tells you what a country believes it lost, what it believes it owns, and what it is willing to teach its children to wait for. And in this story, the map is never just paper. The first mystery is older than Argentina, older than the British colony, older even than the modern argument. Who first saw these islands? British tradition often points to the English navigator John Davis in 1592 and to Captain John Strong, who made the first recorded landing in 1690. Argentine memory reaches back to earlier Iberian voyages linked to Spain and Portugal. The records do not provide a clear answer. They give us fog, sails, claims, and men, turning uncertainty into ownership. For generations, the old story said the islands were uninhabited when Europeans arrived. But wait, notice this. The land itself has begun to whisper of an older possibility. Evidence left behind, charcoal bones and a stone point, suggested that humans may have reached the islands before Europeans, possibly linked to the southern canoe worlds near Tierra del Fuego. However, the land has not yet told us exactly who made those crossings. That matters, because careless empire stories love the phrase empty land. Empty land makes possession sound clean. Empty land makes conquest sound like discovery, with better handwriting. But the southern world was never as empty as European maps portrayed it. The currents had memory before London named them. The weather had meanings before it entered imperial reports. Still, when France, Britain, and Spain began fighting over these islands, there was no known permanent indigenous community living there. That makes the dispute strange, not simple. The first lasting European settlement was established in 1764. French settlers founded Port St. Louis on East Falkland. 1 year later, in 1765, Britain claimed Port Egmont on West Falkland. The following year, a British settlement took shape there. Spain objected because it claimed the larger South Atlantic region through its American empire. Suddenly, these cold, difficult islands became a courtroom with no roof, and three empires spoke over the wind. France eventually handed its settlement to Spain, and Port St. Louis became Puerto Soledad. Britain stayed at Port Egmont. Spain did not accept that. In 1770, Spanish forces pushed the British out, and Europe nearly stumbled into a larger war over a place most Europeans could not find on a map. Britain returned after diplomacy cooled the fire. Britain withdrew again, not because the claim had died, but because an empire is always counting money. Before sailing away, Britain left behind a flag and a plaque saying its sovereignty had not been surrendered. That plaque is one of the ghosts of this story. Imagine the settlement emptied, the fires cold, the roofs rotting in the rain, and still a piece of metal speaking for a crown. Spain later removed the plaque and carried it away to Buenos Aires. But the idea remained. Britain said absence was not surrender. Spain said presence mattered more than a ghost nailed to wood. From 1774 until 1811, Spain maintained the only formal colonial presence on the island, which was connected to the River Plate viceroyalty, whose capital was Buenos Aires. Spanish governors came and went, ships arrived, cattle wandered. Then Napoleon's wars shook Europe, Latin American independence movements rose, and Spain abandoned the settlement. And just like Britain before it, Spain left symbols behind, trying to make the departure sound like ownership continuing in another room. For several years, the islands had no strong government presence. Sealers and whalers used the shores. British and American sailors hunted in waters where the law was mostly whatever a captain could enforce. Then Argentina declared independence from Spain in 1816, and with independence came inheritance. Argentina believed it had inherited Spain's rights in the South Atlantic. In Argentine memory, the Malvinas were not a new desire. They were part of an estate interrupted by empire, distance, and time. In 1820, Colonel David Jewett, sailing for the United Provinces of the River Plate, proclaimed sovereignty over the islands. It was a small act in a vast wind, but symbols matter here. A flag raised in a lonely harbor can become a national promise. In the 1820s, Buenos Aires tried to turn a claim into a settlement. The key figure was Luis Vernet, a merchant who built a fragile community, managed cattle, and seal hunting in waters crowded by foreign ships. Then came the American warship Lexington. In 1831, after Vernet seized American sealing vessels, the Lexington raided the settlement and severely damaged the Argentine authorities there. This part is often skipped, but it matters. By the time Britain returned, the Argentine settlement was already wounded. The islands were not a peaceful village. They were simply interrupted by one British ship. They were a frontier of hungry business, weak states, hard weather, and overlapping flags. History rarely arrives with clean hands. Then came 1833, the year that sits in this story like a locked door. A British naval force arrived and demanded that the Argentine flag come down. The Argentine commander protested, but he was outgunned. He left without a battle. Britain reasserted control and would hold the islands almost continuously from that moment onward, except for the Argentine occupation in 1982. But here the wound splits into two memories, each one carrying its own accusation. Argentina says Britain expelled the Argentine population. British accounts say the military and authorities were removed, while the civilian population was invited to stay, and some did. This is not a small disagreement. If people were driven out and replaced, Argentina's colonial accusation grows sharper. If civilians remained and later generations built a local society, then Britain's self-determination argument would grow stronger. Same harbor, same year, different moral universe. In the early 1840s, Britain moved from military control to formal colonization, appointing a civilian lieutenant governor and eventually making Stanley the capital. Sheep became the economy. Families were born there, buried there, shaped by wet boots, hard work, and distance from almost everywhere. Argentina protested across generations, sometimes loudly, sometimes through diplomatic notes. Britain barely acknowledged the protests. For London, the islands were remote. For Buenos Aires, they were stolen. A wound does not need noise to stay open. After the Second World War, the world changed its language. Empire no longer sounded like destiny. Colonies became nations. The United Nations became a place where old possessions could be challenged with new words. Argentina raised the Malvinas question as a colonial dispute. Britain answered with the people living there. Argentina said sovereignty must be negotiated between states. Britain said the islanders' wishes came first. That argument still circles the same table like a tired animal refusing to die. In 1965, the United Nations passed Resolution 2065, calling on Britain and Argentina to seek a peaceful solution while taking into account the interests of the islanders. Notice the word interests, not exactly wishes. Argentina held tightly to that language. Britain held tightly to self-determination. One word became a fortress. One phrase became a border. In diplomacy, countries sometimes fight over grammar because they know grammar can become territory. Then, in 1966, the dispute briefly became theater and terror. Argentine nationalists hijacked a civilian plane and forced it to land on the islands. They raised the Argentine flag, took hostages, and demanded recognition of Argentine sovereignty. They surrendered the next day, surrounded by the small local defense force. But the message had landed. The Malvinas were not just an archive file. For some Argentines, they were sacred territory, and sacred territory can attract dangerous men. During the 1970s, Britain quietly explored ideas that sound almost impossible today: shared sovereignty and a transfer followed by a long leaseback. This gradual solution might satisfy Argentina while protecting the islanders from sudden abandonment. Why would Britain even consider this? Because before the war, the islands looked expensive, distant, and modest: sheep, fishing, weather, and a small population. But in Stanley, those ideas felt like betrayal in a suit. The islanders did not want to be passed from flag to flag. Argentina did not want a slow imperial timer either. It wanted sovereignty. Then Argentina fell fully into the darkness of military dictatorship. By the early 1980s, the junta was losing legitimacy. The economy was failing. Protest was growing. The dirty war had left thousands disappeared, tortured, murdered, and swallowed by silence. The generals needed a miracle with a flag on it. They looked south and saw the Malvinas, the one cause that could make crowds cheer even while the state was rotting. Dictatorships love sacred causes, because sacred causes can hide ugly foundations. General Leopoldo Galtieri and the junta believed a quick victory would rescue them. They also misread the world. They thought Britain was too distant, too tired, too weak to fight. They thought the United States would not turn against a useful anti-communist ally. They confused being useful with being protected. That mistake has ruined many governments that thought they understood the empire standing behind them. The immediate road to war ran through another cold island. In early 1982, Argentine scrap metal workers landed on South Georgia, another British-controlled territory also claimed by Argentina, and raised the Argentine flag. Britain protested, but from Buenos Aires, the response looked weak. The junta saw hesitation and mistook it for surrender. This is how disasters begin, not always with certainty. Sometimes a leader stares at another country and sees only what he wants to see. On April 2, 1982, Argentina launched Operation Rosario. Marines and commandos landed by ship, helicopter, armored vehicle, and air support. The British defenders were few: Royal Marines and local volunteers, brave but badly outnumbered, with no combat aircraft and no heavy defenses. Stanley fell quickly. Argentina poured thousands of troops into the islands until more soldiers stood there than the islands had ever seen people at one time. In Buenos Aires, crowds celebrated. The dictatorship wrapped itself in the recovered islands like a holy cloak. But Britain did not accept the new reality. Margaret Thatcher's government sent a task force south, across almost 13,000 kilometers of ocean. Carriers, destroyers, frigates, submarines, supply ships, merchant vessels turned into military lifelines, and young men heading toward a battlefield many had never imagined before being ordered there. The South Atlantic became a road made of storms. Britain was not only fighting Argentina, it was fighting distance, weather, fuel, time, and the possibility that its old power had finally become obsolete. Then the war became brutal. On May 2nd, the British submarine Conqueror sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano outside the declared exclusion zone, after Britain had warned that the zone was not the only place where threats could be attacked. 323 people on board died, many in freezing water. In Argentina, the sinking became a wound inside the wound. In Britain, it was defended as a hard military decision. The sea took the bodies and kept moving. The map did not blink. 2 days later, Argentina answered from the air. An Exocet missile struck the British destroyer Sheffield. Fire moved through steel, smoke-filled compartments. 20 men died, and the ship later sank. The British public, which had watched the task force sail like an old imperial gesture, now saw that this was not theater. The South Atlantic was eating ships. Argentine pilots flew low over water with extraordinary courage, sometimes so low their aircraft seemed to be skimming the skin of the sea. When British troops landed at San Carlos, the narrow waters became known as Bomb Alley. Argentine aircraft came again and again, diving through missiles, guns, and clouds toward British ships. Some bombs failed to explode because they had been dropped too low to arm properly. Others worked exactly as designed. Ships burned, men drowned. Helicopters lifted casualties through the smoke. The landing succeeded, but the cost announced what the rest of the campaign would be. Victory bought one terrified minute at a time. On land, the suffering had another face. Many Argentine soldiers were young conscripts, cold, hungry, poorly supplied, and dug into peat and rock. Later testimonies and investigations described men beaten, humiliated, left without proper food, and in some cases punished brutally by their own officers. We should speak carefully here because memory after war is a battlefield too, but the pattern is too dark to ignore. Some boys were fighting Britain in front of them and fear behind them. The islanders suffered as well. At Goose Green, civilians were confined in harsh conditions while armies fought around them. The battle there became one of the first major British land victories. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones was killed leading an assault and later awarded Britain's highest decoration for valor. Around him, men on both sides crawled through fire, mud, and fear. Goose Green proved the British could move inland. It also proved the islands would not be retaken without blood. Then came the loss of Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant ship turned military carrier. Struck by Argentine missiles, it carried the helicopters Britain desperately needed. When it burned and sank, the campaign changed shape. More British troops had to march across the islands on foot, carrying heavy loads through freezing rain, bog, and stone. That detail matters. Wars are not only won by grand strategy, sometimes they are won by exhausted men walking because the machines that were supposed to carry them are at the bottom of the sea. At Bluff Cove, disaster came in daylight. Argentine aircraft struck the landing ships Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram while British troops were still aboard or nearby. Flames consumed compartments. Men jumped into the cold sea with burns on their bodies. Helicopters hovered over the smoke to pull survivors out. On Sir Galahad alone, 48 men died. 2 crewmen died on Sir Tristram, and the wider attacks that day brought the British dead to 56, with around 150 wounded. The final battles around Stanley were fought on cold ridges whose names became carved into regimental memory: Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet, Tumbledown, Wireless Ridge. At Mount Longdon, the fighting turned close, confused, and savage. Mines, machine guns, artillery, grenades, bayonets, men shouting in the dark. British paratroopers and Argentine defenders fought for hours over a rock that probably meant nothing to either of them before the war gave it a name. By morning, the mountain had become a grave. The land had been bombed, shelled, cut open, dug into, mined, and marked with graves. That is the thing about battlefields. They keep receipts without speaking. A trench collapses, but does not forget. A rusted fragment stays in the soil. A minefield turns grass into a warning. The islands not only hosted the war, they absorbed it. Even the civilians were not spared by the final push. On the night of June 11th into June 12th, British naval shelling killed 3 Falkland Island women in Stanley: Susan Whitley, Doreen Bonner, and Mary Goodwin. Their deaths sit awkwardly in every heroic telling, because war does not care whose flag a civilian prefers. Shells do not ask constitutional questions before entering a house. The islanders were not only symbols of self-determination, they were people trapped between armies, waiting for the sky to stop falling. On June 14, 1982, Argentine forces surrendered. The war had lasted 74 days. 649 Argentine service members were dead. 255 British service members were dead. 3 island civilians were dead. More than 11,000 Argentine troops became prisoners. The junta's glory collapsed into humiliation. In Argentina, defeat helped break the dictatorship and open the road back toward democracy. But democracy inherited the same wound. The Malvinas cause did not die with the generals who abused it. That is one of the cruelest turns in the story. Argentina invaded to recover the islands, but the invasion made Britain less able to ever give them up. Before 1982, London could quietly imagine compromise. After 1982, compromise looked like betrayal to the dead. Graves are not legal documents, but they speak loudly in politics. They speak to veterans. They speak to families. They speak to ministers who know that one wrong sentence can make a sacrifice feel wasted. The United States tried to remain neutral at first, then leaned toward Britain, providing intelligence, missiles, fuel, and diplomatic support. In London, that became part of the friendship myth between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. In Latin America, it was remembered differently. Argentina was a hemispheric partner, yet when the crisis came, Washington chose Britain. The lesson many heard was bitter. Latin America could be useful to the United States, but not equal to Europe in the imperial imagination. That is why Western audiences often misunderstand the Malvinas. They ask, why does Argentina care so much? But from Latin America, the map feels different. This is a continent where distant crowns drew borders, extracted wealth, named lands, and then asked everyone to respect the paperwork. To many in the region, a British territory near Patagonia does not look like a harmless curiosity. It looks like the old century is refusing to leave the room. After the war, Britain fortified the islands. Royal Air Force Mount Pleasant became a permanent military shield, with long runways, radar, aircraft shelters, troops, and the ability to reinforce quickly. Today, British Typhoon fighters guard the sky, supported by air defenses and patrol forces. In 1982, Argentina attacked a lightly defended archipelago. Today, any attacker would meet radar, missiles, modern aircraft, and a Britain that has already paid the price of underestimating the danger once. Argentina's military, meanwhile, had been weakened for decades by economic crisis and political caution. Javier Milei has begun trying to rebuild some capability, including the purchase of used F-16 fighters from Denmark. But fighter jets alone do not create an invasion. You need ships, logistics, trained troops, air cover, and the ability to cross the rough ocean under British fire. Argentina knows this. Milei has spoken of diplomacy, long timelines, and persuasion. The next battle, if it comes, will not begin with landing craft. It will begin with recognition. It will begin with pressure. It will begin with countries saying Britain must negotiate. And now the islands matter. Not only because of history, but because of what lies under the sea. The Sea Lion oil field, north of the islands, has moved toward development after years of delay, with first oil expected around 2028. One sanctioned phase targets around 170 million barrels, with wider resources beyond that. Oil gives old arguments new teeth. Oil never calms a territorial wound, it gives the wound a gold tooth. For Stanley, oil could mean wealth, infrastructure, and a transformed economy. For Argentina, it looks like a treasure being drawn from disputed waters. For Britain, it adds another reason to hold firm. For diplomats, it adds a smell everyone recognizes: profit. And when profit enters a sovereignty dispute, the speeches become louder, the maps more colorful, and the moral language suddenly very expensive. Then came the Chagos shadow. Britain signed an agreement to transfer sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius, while retaining the military base on Diego Garcia through a 99-year lease. By 2026, that path had been delayed by new American opposition. Still, Argentina had already taken the symbol it wanted: Britain, under pressure, negotiating over a distant island claim. The comparison is imperfect. Chagos involved forced displacement. The Falklands involve a present population that overwhelmingly wants to remain British. But imperfect comparisons still move politics. Beyond the islands, the southern map grows darker. Argentina also disputes South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, and farther south, Antarctica sleeps under treaties and ice. The mining ban there can be reviewed after 24 to 48 hours, though it does not simply expire like a rental agreement. Still, states think in generations. They look at empty water and imagine shipping lanes, resources, leverage, bases, and flags. The South Atlantic is not empty. It is only quiet until profit, pride, or fear begins to speak. In 2013, the islanders voted almost unanimously to remain a British overseas territory, with turnout above 90%. Britain sees that as decisive. Argentina rejects it, arguing that a transplanted population cannot decide sovereignty over land. Argentina says was taken by force. This is the heart of the dispute. Britain says people. Argentina says it is its territory. Britain says choice. Argentina says inheritance. The islanders say home, and the map, cruel thing that it is, refuses to satisfy all three. This is where cheap storytelling fails. Some versions make Argentina sound cartoonish, as if only madness could care about islands Britain has governed for so long. Other versions erase the islanders completely, as if living people become invisible when a nation claims the land as its own. Both versions are lazy. The harder truth is more interesting. Argentina has a real historical grievance. Britain has a real self-determination argument. The islanders have a real home, and history has no mercy for clean endings. So when the leaked Pentagon email appeared, the reason it mattered was not that America could magically hand the islands to Argentina. It cannot. One memo does not lower a flag in Stanley, but Washington can change the diplomatic weather. If the United States ever moved toward Argentina's position, other countries might follow. Britain would become more isolated. Argentina would feel history tilting. the battlefield would not be a beach. It would be a sentence in an international statement. That is why this is not really about Iran. Iran is the spark. Britain is not even the whole story. The deeper story is that Latin America remembers land differently from the way empires do. Empires remember treaties, plaques, garrisons, and administration. Latin America remembers absence, extraction, distance, and the arrogance of faraway capitals. The islanders remember something else again: grandparents, houses, schools, war nights, graves, and the right not to be transferred like a file. And still the old objects return. The plaque Britain left behind when it sailed away. The map Argentina prints as a promise. The graves from 1982. The oil field lies beneath cold water. Each one says something different about ownership. The plaque says memory can survive absence. The map says loss can become identity. The grave says blood changes politics. The oil says even ghosts become more dangerous when money starts rising from the seabed. The land itself remains quiet. The wind does not care what name you use. The sheep do not know which constitution claims the grass. The penguins do not recognize the border, but humans do. We build nations out of memory, and then we ask the dead to bless the lines. That is the spell of the Malvinas, the Falklands. They are not important because they are crowded. They are important because they hold too many meanings for one place to carry peacefully. So this is the war that became a ghost. It ended in 1982, but it never fully left. It moved into classrooms, speeches, military bases, veteran memories, diplomatic cables, oil contracts, and the names people choose when they speak. Now, as alliances fray and old powers threaten each other with old wounds, the ghost is moving again, not marching, not landing, just breathing under the map. And maybe that is the most haunting part. The Malvinas were never truly settled. They were only quiet. So tell me what you think. When history, inheritance, and self-determination all point in different directions, who should the map listen to first? The state that says a stolen thing must be returned, the people living under the wind today, or the dead whose graves made the question almost impossible to bury? Thank you for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.